This is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek, and we're discussing the collapse of the U.S. supported regime, puppet government and military in Afghanistan, and what led up to this collapse, and what has been going on in Afghanistan and that region that led up to this present crisis for U.S. capitalism, U.S. imperialism. And joining us is George Wright. He's a former professor, Skyline College, Community College, and Chico State College. And George has done a lot of his work, theoretical work on U.S. imperialism in the Middle East and the role of the United States internationally. So welcome, George.
Oh, thanks, Steve. It's my honor.
So maybe we can start with U.S. Quote unquote interests in the Middle East, including focusing on Iran and the role of the United States in overthrowing the Mossadegh government in 1953, because the United States has seen an interest in controlling the Middle East and its relationship to Afghanistan as part of that. So why don't we, from your point of view, talk about the history of the United States and why we're in the present situation?
The common feeling about the Middle East and U.S. policy is around the issue of oil. And as you know, some 73% approximately of the known oil reserves in the world reside in the Middle East. And I would support that oil is a primary objective of U.S. interests in that region. But I also think that there's some bigger aspects to what U.S. policy is about, related to not only the Middle East, but also Central Asia, where Afghanistan is posited. I subscribe to some of the ideas of around the issue of world capitalist system, and also the ideas of hegemony. And I think looking at U.S. policy in several stages, one immediately after the war, World War II, up until 1991, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, is one chapter. And then after 1991 is another period, and we're still living in that period. During the period when the Soviet Union existed, the United States' goal was to have influence in the Middle East and to try to create situations that maintain their influence there. But that was not very simple to carry out, because there were several tendencies. For example, in 1951 in Iran, there was a democratic election where Mohammad Mossadegh was elected prime minister of Iran, and his government fairly quickly began to nationalize oil reserves in Iran and take over those oil fields from British Petroleum, which was something that the United States didn't like. In 1953, the United States staged a coup d'etat in Iran that overthrew that government and installed the Shah of Iran as a major client in the Middle East for the United States, as well as a kind of a pillar of U.S. policies in that region, particularly the Persian Gulf region.
And that led to a rise in fundamentalism in opposition to the United States and the Shah in Iran.
Yes, well, there were a number of tendencies in Iran, political tendencies that were in resistance. The Two-Day Party, the Communist Party, there were socialist elements, as well as fundamentalist elements as well, centering around the mullahs, the bazaar, and Khomeini later. The other point I want to make is that there was another country in the Persian Gulf region that was also problematic for the U.S., and that was Iraq, where in the late 50s, there was a quote unquote revolution in Iraq, overthrowing a monarchy, and a nationalist secular government came into power under the leadership of the Ba'ath Party. And that movement was in parallel, if not integral, to the revolutions that were going on in the Middle East and also North Africa under the guise of Arab nationalism. I think the most prominent example of that in people's minds would be Abdel Nasser in Egypt. So the US, from that point on, from the late 50s, had to come up with a strategy as to how to maintain access and control over the Persian Gulf. And they came up with a policy called dual containment. And the idea behind dual containment was to not allow either Iraq or Iran to become the regional hegemon in the Persian Gulf. Now, obviously, the United States also was allied very closely with Saudi Arabia. And over the years, Saudi Arabia would become a major instrument in dealing with that area of the world. But in 1978, as most of the listeners understand, there was the rise of a major successful resistance movement, largely an urban-based resistance movement, with a number of different of the political elements that we just mentioned. And they were able to overthrow the Shah of Iran back in the winter of 78, 79. And from that, at that moment, there was a wrestling for power under the leadership, or at least the banner, of Ayatollah Khomeini. The result of this fairly quickly was that an Islamic regime was put into place called the Islamic Republic, which was extremely problematic to the United States at that point. Now, related to Afghanistan, what is happening at this point is that up until the overthrow of the Shah, Iran played more or less a major strategic role for the United States vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and vis-a-vis also Afghanistan. Related to the Soviet Union, Iran was a place where there were US bases as well as listing points to do surveillance and spying in the Soviet Union. In fact, former CIA head Stansfield Turner once said that we can hear the toilets flush in the Kremlin to show how vigorous that spying was. Vis-a-vis Afghanistan, things were going to be a little bit different because Iran played the role of trying to seduce the Afghan government into the pro-Western camp. There was kind of a jockeying back and forth, but basically Afghanistan was under the umbrella of the Soviet Union at this particular point in time. Much of its foreign aid, training of its military, its education, many of the people who had education went to Moscow to get education as well. So Afghanistan was not a client necessarily of the Soviet Union, but it definitely was influenced very strongly by the Soviet Union. So it is at this point that the United States decides that it has to get more directly involved in Afghanistan. Now we have to back off a minute and comment on the events that were happening in Afghanistan at this time. There was a monarchy up until 1973, 73, I guess, under the leadership of Zaire Khan. In 1973, there was a coup d'etat, an anti-monarchist coup d'etat led by a fellow by the name of Mohammed Daoud. And that coup led to a republic, Afghanistan becoming a republic. And under Daoud, there was efforts to institute certain reforms, modernizing reforms related to land reform, education, improving conditions for women, etc. As these events were unfolding, there still was some conflict and interscene rivalry within the government and also within the People's Democratic Party, which was an urban-based party centered particularly around Kabul, that was peopled by young, educated people, many of them who have been educated in Soviet Union, and they looked at themselves as revolutionaries wanting to modernize the Afghanistan. If one looked at the agenda of these modernizers, I don't think one would be very critical of what they wanted to achieve. Land reform, compulsory education, rights for women, education, job opportunities for women, a secular-oriented regime. But Daoud at the same time was very repressive against elements within the People's Democratic Party. And so in, when was it? April of 1978, there was a revolution in Afghanistan. One can debate whether it was actually a revolution or not. Clearly, there was an overthrow of Daoud's government. And what we see is a government put into place by a fellow by the name of Tareki. And what he proposed was the speed up of many of these modernizing reforms, centering particularly around land reform and rights for women. And I would say, thirdly, secularism was also part of the agenda. As this was unfolding, what we see is a resistance emerge in the countryside, in the rural sectors of Afghanistan against this central government and the reform struggles, a project that was underway. We could go into great detail about the countryside of Afghanistan, but what we can, to kind of simplify it, we can just say basically it was a traditional rural-based society with khans or elders or leaders that had controlled various local regions of Afghanistan, and agriculture was and herding were the major economic elements at the time. These this countryside or these traditional elements, so were very staunchly traditionalists related to Islam, and were opposed to the kind of reforms that the urban reformers or revolutionaries wanted to carry out. And in July of 1978, what we begin to see is various local areas of Afghanistan beginning to carry out resistance against the policies of the central government, or the government was actually technically wasn't centralized yet. Now, one of the problems that the government under Tareki had was to carry out these changes from a top-down point of view, or one could even argue a Stalinist point of view, rather than developing close bonds on a local level with the peasant class, et cetera. And when the resistance took place, the central government under Tareki began to carry out torture and arrest people, et cetera. Resistance intensified. And we see the government being more repressive, including bombing various resistance groups, et cetera, et cetera. And at that point, this is summer of 78 into 1979. Now, keep in mind, the events that I'm describing here are kind of a spin-off and parallel to the events that are happening in Iran as well. So in early 1979, Tareki went to Moscow to try to get support, military support from the Soviet Union. And he met with a number of elements within the Kremlin. And one of the Kremlin was prepared to give Kabul military support and increased training. But Tariki also asked if the Soviet Union would bring in troops, ground troops, to deal with the resistance. And the Kremlin was opposed to that. In fact, Kosygin told Tariki when he was in Moscow the following. This is in February of 1979. Kosygin, who was the prime minister of the Soviet Union, said, the entry of our troops into Afghanistan would outrage the international community, triggering a string of extreme negative consequences in many different areas. Our common enemies are just waiting for the moment when Soviet troops appear in Afghanistan. This will give them the excuse they need to send armed bands into the country. So in early 1979, the Soviet Union was not prepared and willing to intervene directly into what was going on in Afghanistan. But as the year unfolded, a number of developments took place that by the late part of 1979 changed the equation in the Kremlin. I think three things stand out. One, the resistance increases into the year against the central government, the ineffectiveness of Kabul to find ways of moderating the process. And then in July of 1979, an interesting development took place. And that is that Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor for President Jimmy Carter, began to give covert military support to the various resistance groups in Afghanistan. And in fact, the popular understanding of the Soviet intervention into Afghanistan was that the Soviet Union intervened in 1979, in late 79 in December, and it was after the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan that the United States under the Carter administration responded. But that chronology is not correct. It's quite different, and that is that the United States began giving military support to the resistance in Afghanistan, actually with the intent of accelerating the crisis and the destabilization of the country, at the same time to actually provoke the Soviet Union into Afghanistan. Brzezinski was interviewed in 1998 by the French magazine Le Nouvel Observateur. And he was asked about US involvement in Afghanistan during that period, 79 onwards. In the interview in Le Nouvel Observateur, he was asked the following. This is not a long interview, but I think it's very important for the historical record to hear what transpired. He was asked, Brzezinski was asked, the former director of the CIA, Robert Gates, stated in his memoirs that the American intelligence services began to aid the Mujahideen in Afghanistan 6 months before the Soviet intervention. Is this period, you were the national security advisor to President Carter. You therefore played a key role in this affair. Is this correct? Brzezinski went on to say, yes, according to the official version of history, CIA aid to the Mujahideen began during 1980. That is to say, after the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan on December 24th, 1979. But the reality, closely guarded until now, is completely otherwise. Brzezinski goes on to say, indeed, it was July 3rd, 1979, that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. And that very day, I wrote a note to the president in which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention. Question: despite this risk, you were an advocate of the covert action, but perhaps you yourself desired this Soviet entry into the war and looked for a way to provoke it? Brzezinski: it wasn't quite like that. We didn't push the Russians to intervene, but we knowingly increased the probability that they would. Question: when the Soviets justified their intervention by asserting that they intended to fight against the secret US involvement in Afghanistan, nobody believed them. However, there was an element of truth in this. You don't regret any of this today. Brzezinski: regret what? That secret operation was an excellent idea. It had the effect of drawing the Russians into the Afghan trap. And you want me to regret it? The day that the Soviets officially crossed the border, I wrote to President Carter essentially, quote, "We now have the opportunity of giving to the USSR its Vietnam War." Indeed, for almost 10 years, Moscow had to carry out a war that was unsustainable for the regime, a conflict that brought about the demoralization and finally the breakup of the Soviet Empire. Question: and neither do you regret having supported Islamic fundamentalism, which has given arms and advice to future terrorists? Brzezinski: what is more important in world history, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some agitated Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? Question: some agitated Muslims, but it has been said and repeated, Islamic fundamentalism represents a world menace today. Brzezinski, speaking in 1998, 3 years before 9/11. Nonsense. It is said that the West has a global policy in regard to Islam. That is stupid. There isn't a global Islam. Look at Islam in a rational manner, without demagoguery or emotionalism. It is the leading religion of the world with 1.5 billion followers. But what is there to be concerned among fundamentalists Saudi Arabia, moderate Morocco, militarist Pakistan, pro-Western Egypt, or secularist Central Asia? Nothing more than what unites the Christian countries. Now, I'm going to kind of stop at this juncture with this chronology and propose the following. In the last week, we've seen that the Taliban has effectively carried out a guerrilla insurgency to defeat the United States' militarized occupation in Afghanistan. And here in 1979, we have the National Security Advisor, Brzezinski, carrying out a covert operation to suck the Soviet Union into Afghanistan with the intent of breaking the Soviet Empire. Now, we know for a fact that by the late 1980s, the Soviet Union began a process of disintegration, which occurred in 1991. But the strange historical irony here is that decades later, in some ways, the United States is repeating exactly what happened to the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And it kind of reaffirms the adage that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. You can ask Alexander the Great how he felt about Afghanistan, and certainly the three British-Afghan wars, the British would have their own opinions about that as well.
Let's go to the rise of the Taliban, the rise of Osama bin Laden, who is supposedly responsible for 9/11, allegedly. The United States was involved in supporting bin Laden and these fundamentalists and gathering them up around the world. That was what the CIA in the United States was doing. They were actually, in organizing to overthrow the Soviet Union, bringing the most radical jihadists, fundamentalist elements together in Afghanistan. Is that the case?
Oh, there's no question. The last 20 years or a little bit more of terrorism, if you will, so-called Islamic terrorism. And you could list the groups: Al Qaeda, Al Nusra Front, ISIS, the Taliban, etc. What's fundamentally important, and I apologize for using the word fundamental at this point, is that the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan in the 1970s, funding Islamic militants, the Mujahideen, etc., is literally the seedbed for the rise of these various jihadist groups over the last 25 or 30 years. Without the Afghan war of the 80s, and certainly without the US's involvement, those movements and groups would never have emerged. It's certainly not emerged in the forms that they did and with the agendas that they did.
And this was the freedom fighters. These were portrayed. Osama bin Laden was personally portrayed as a freedom fighter who was fighting for a good outcome in Afghanistan. That's how the United States portrayed
President
him.
Reagan invited members of the so-called Afghanistan freedom fighters to the White House and introduced them as the founding fathers, if you will, of Afghanistan. So this was a project that was funded and celebrated at the same time. Now, what were the motives? Well, first of all, what did the U.S. do? I think there are three stages, and we cannot underplay the resistance, the indigenous resistance in Afghanistan to the policies of the central government, and certainly the resistance to the Soviet occupation at that time. That was indigenous and was not created by the United States or any other actors. But certainly the United States and other actors, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, etc., took full advantage of that indigenous resistance. Now, that indigenous resistance, in looking at it from a modern position, if you will, certainly a secular and certainly a Marxist position, one would be opposed to that resistance because it was a traditionalist, feudalist, and religiously inclined, and against advancements for women, education, and the like. I want to put that on the table. But that resistance was opposed to the land reform policies of Kabul. They were opposed to the secularization of the government and policy, meaning the separation of church and state. And they were also opposed to the liberalization of policies and attitudes for women, for example, allowing women to go to school, wear Western dress, et cetera, et cetera. And so then when you add to it the resistance of the Soviet Union, is the Soviet Union was an occupier, one. Two, the Soviet Union, from their vantage point, was the incubator for these reformists in Kabul, which they were opposed to. And thirdly, the Soviet Union was Marxist, therefore it was atheist. And so that was basically the nature of the resistance, as well as trying to, again, prevent the occupation. Now, the next level, though, in Pakistan, who plays a very important role here. By the way, I would suggest that people look at an atlas. I think one of the problems of wars that the U.S. gets involved in, that the average person has no idea of the geography of these wars and where the U.S. is involved in. This may sound cynical on my part, but years and years and years ago, I always felt that I was going to learn the geography of most of the world because the U.S. was probably going to go to war with most countries throughout the world. And 60 some years later, I feel like I have a pretty good handle on the geography of most of the world. But Afghanistan, at the time when the Soviet Union still existed, was in Central Asia. It's basically, its northern border was about 1,100 miles with the Soviet Union. And across that border, there were Soviet republics with upwards of some 35 million people who practice Islam. To the immediate south of Afghanistan, a border that ran about 1,600 miles, was Pakistan. Immediately to the west of Afghanistan is Iran, where there is a border of about 572 miles. Interestingly, there is a very specific little quirky geographical geopolitical part of Afghanistan called the Wakhan Strip, which ironically borders China by, I think, about 52 miles. Okay, so that knowing where it's posited, I think, is very important to understand the politics, the geopolitics that are surrounding it. Back to Pakistan, there were some 5 Pakistani Islamic parties in the 1970s and 80s. And each one of those parties more or less had made alliances with different regional Islamic, pro-Islamic resistance forces in Afghanistan, providing personnel and providing material as well. Now, Pakistan was under the leadership of a guy named General Zia, and Zia obviously backed up these policies. The third level of this was more direct policies on the part of the United States, providing monies to Zia in Pakistan and providing monies to these Islamic parties that existed in Pakistan. The US also funded Osama bin Laden to the tune of anywhere between $3 to $4 billion. And what bin Laden did was to recruit Islamic people, young men from around the world, for this jihad to fight against the atheist Soviet Union. And upwards of 100,000 or so men came to Afghanistan to fight in this struggle. So what we can say is that initially this struggle was an internal civil war, and it shifted as the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan into a internationalized civil war. And as the United States got more involved, that label holds true. And then I would argue that the war also became a proxy war for the United States as well, using these Islamic forces, the Mujahideen and the Afghan Arabs under bin Laden in this struggle. Now, the goal on the part of the United States at this time was to I'm going to just blunt it out. It was to bleed the Soviet Union. The concerns about the Afghan people was absolutely nil. The goal of the United States was, as Brzezinski said to Carter, was to give the Soviet Union their own Vietnam. And that implied overextension, overreach, military defeat, withdrawal, and embarrassment, and a lack of credibility among its allies. Something that may be happening to the United States right now, by the way.
This United States support of a jihadist war against the Soviet Union, this was, part of the policy of the Democrats and Republicans. This was a bipartisan policy to have
this was a bipartisan project. I think what's interesting, Steve, at this point, there was another front, if you will, on the part of the United States, and that's what I call Reagan's Central American Wars. And I would argue, and I think you would agree with me on this, in Congress in the early 1980s, there was still large congressional resistance to Reagan's wars in Central America. In fact, in 1982, we have Representative Bolin introducing the Bolin Amendment, which cut off funding to Nicaragua, as I recall. And it was at that point, and this is another spinoff to the events of this period, is that CIA Director Casey and Oliver North and others began to find resources to create the Contras to fight in Nicaragua. Where did they find the resources? From Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and they also got resources, sold weapons to Iran, even though the U.S.'s official policy towards Iran is that it was a terrorist state and it wouldn't do business with it. Now, by 85, 86, we see the emergence of the Iran-Contra affair, which exposes a lot of these things. So there was resistance in the early stages of the Reagan administration to the Central American wars. And obviously, we had major activism against those wars in the United States. But there wasn't the same level of resistance to these wars in Congress. And for that matter, in the general public related to Afghanistan. And I think we'll kind of table the question why till a little bit later. But I think when we talk about the current realities of Afghanistan and the US and the support of the occupation, the left has been put in a trap that has worked very closely because it has found itself. When I say the left, I'm talking about so-called liberals within the Democratic Party who see themselves as anti-war, and also the so-called sectarian left groups, where they've actually supported the occupation because of the fact that the resistance, the Taliban, are against female or women's rights, forgetting that the U.S. has carried out bombing of Afghanistan, killing at least 150,000 people. Among those, the vast majority have been old folks, children, and women, by the way. So it's a fascinating thread related to this whole story.
The fact that the United States really brought the Taliban to power in Afghanistan with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the defeat of the Soviet Union intervention into Afghanistan, then the idea that, you know, you can organize the fundamentalists to fight the Russian infidels and there's no connection to the American infidels.
Right. Well,
there's a disconnect. I mean, the idea is we're going to fight the bad Russian infidels, but you're actually organizing people who don't believe in whether Russian or American or any other non-believers.
Well, that
seems like the height of insanity, really.
That's the catch-22 to the story, because when the Soviet Union disintegrated, now the U.S. was the sole superpower, and it now had access to do what I call the pursuit of absolute global hegemony, which means that areas of the world, i.e. the Middle East, Persian Gulf area, Central Asia, that were off limits, or at least the U.S. had limited ability to influence, now it was there for the picking, okay? And so what you see is Bush Sr. With Scowcroft and Eagleburger and all of his cronies create a false scenario and create a situation where Saddam stupidly, I don't know how he fell for this trick, actually invaded Kuwait, which gave the justification for the so-called First Gulf War. And the U.S. went into Iraq and forced the Iraqi army out of Kuwait at the cost of, I think, at least 200,000 people dying, okay? Now, Bush Sr. celebrated because he was wise enough not to march to Baghdad, you know? What he did do, though, is he hoped that there would be a a Shia Sunni bloodbath in the country, and that did happen to some degree. But what happened at that point is the US then used Saudi Arabia as a base for US troops, okay? And the US was bombing Iraq. So here, Osama bin Laden, in real terms and symbolically, are watching this happen. And they come to the conclusion, one, that the US having bases in Saudi Arabia is going against the precepts of Islam, which is a holy place. And so they are now infidels. And then on the other side of the coin, the US bombing Iraq was no better than the Soviet Union. And so now bin Laden turns against the United States. And we understand the history of that process, or that trajectory, certainly up through 9/11 in 2001.
Biden was centrally involved, and the Democrats, in supporting the invasion of Iraq. In other words, the right of the United States to invade Iraq was a bipartisan. Again, the Democrats and Republicans killed, hundreds of thousands, and led to the greatest migration of people since the Second World War in their attack on Iraq.
Oh, of course. Yeah, this is a bipartisan project. Okay. Now, I will say that there are some differences of opinion within the foreign policy establishment as these events are unfolding. And we don't have enough time, nor do I have a blackboard to kind of outline these differences. But what you're also seeing is, from Bush 1 or Bush Senior to Bush 2, a evolution within the foreign policy establishment from what I call the managerial realist, like Bush Senior, Gates, Scowcroft, et cetera, who, they're imperialists and they carry out war, but they also see the dangers, and they're willing to back off at certain times. By the early 2000s, the Bush administration, the Bush Jr., the second Bush administration, is surrounded by the neoconservatives, who are, by the way, we need to back off, is that the Clinton administration was influenced by realists, then by the so-called liberal interventionists, which are people who see themselves as Democrats, but also see themselves as, we're going to intervene not because we're imperialists, but we're going to intervene because we're humanistic, or we're humanitarians, and we believe in the right to protect. Now, out of that comes the notion of preemption. We go in to prevent a genocide, i.e., now all of this is a rationalization for imperialism. This is not reality.
Cheney recorded in 60 Minutes talking about the oil fields that he was going to take over. Yeah. They had them all mapped out, the oil workers. And at the time when there was a debate in the United States, the supporters of the invasion of Iraq were saying that the Iraqis would allow the United States would pay for the invasion by the oil that we would get out of Iraq.
Right. Well, that was a plan,
and that's Trump's position too. Trump, we should just take over the oil and pay for U.S. imperialist intervention with their own oil, and they're not going to fight back. They'll just give us the oil, and that's how it's going to be.
Cheney and Rumsfeld and all of those folks were now neoconservatives, okay, where they created their own fantasies and realities and acted upon them, even though they, as you say, Steve, they were going to go in. The war was going to take a few days. It'd be a cake run or something that Rumsfeld said, and then they were going to take the oil and have it paid. Obviously, it didn't turn out to be that way.
I guess the Iraqis did not want to give away their natural resources to the United States, but then we're coming up on 9/11 very shortly, and you have a situation in which the people that we funded, the jihadists, bin Laden, are now at war with the United States, with U.S. capitalists and U.S. intervention. and they organized the bombing. And there's a question of who was behind it, how it was organized. But the fact of the matter is, wasn't Saudi Arabia a key player as far as the bombing at 9/11?
There's no question. I mean, Osama bin Laden is a Saudi Arabian. His family is high up within the royal family. And I think I forgot the numbers, but of the so-called, I think it was 18 so-called terrorists that carried the bombing, the World Trade Center Pentagon attack out, 14 of them were from Saudi Arabia. Now, at that point, the U.S. ignored that reality and decided that they were going to target Afghanistan rather than to put some kind of penalties on Saudi Arabia.
Saudis leave the United States during
Oh,
the
yeah,
shutdown.
there were Saudi family members that were in the United States, and even though there was a no-fly zone throughout the entire country, they were allowed to fly out of the country. Yeah, there's no question about that. That linkage is sinister, to say the least.
There was a cover-up of the role of Saudi Arabia in
Right.
allowing this to be organized,
Right.
the attack on the United States, because the United States worked with the Saudi royalty, the theocracy there, to get oil and to its international
Right, and
investments.
to buy weapons too, because this is a weapons bazaar, is what this is all about as well. Yeah, but I want to back off before we get a little bit into the 9/11 and the attack on Afghanistan, to make some comments about the world in 2001 and what the agenda was on the part of the neoconservatives around Bush Jr. or Bush II. There are a couple points that I want to make, and I'll try to do them as briefly as possible. U.S. policy at one, the Soviet Union no longer exists. The U.S. looks at the entire world as an area where it can gain global hegemony. The Russia is still reeling from the transition from communism to capitalism going into the early 2000s. Putin had just become president, but there wasn't a clear sign that he was a Russian nationalist and was committed to the defense of Russian national sovereignty and interest. And China was just about to emerge as the unquestioned economic competitor to the United States. So 2000, 2001, 2002 is a period of great change, but it wasn't, the fruition of what all of this was to become was about to happen, but it wasn't 100% clear at that particular moment. So that's the historical framework. The second point is US policy at that point under Bush, carried out by neoconservatives, were based on one, Halford Mackinder's heartland theory, which is based on the premise that who controls Eastern Europe controls Eurasia. Who controls Eurasia controls the world island, and who controls the world island controls the world. Well, Eurasia is given. The world island is Eurasia and Africa. The heartland, who controls East Europe, controls the heartland. The heartland is Russia, okay? And this is all viewed from the US and the post-Cold War period as this giant geographical area with the largest number of people in the world, all of the resources possible, and this enormous market, okay? And so all the US has to do is to take it over, okay? And how is it going to do that? So there's a two-pronged strategy. One prong is financialization, okay? Using money and the dollar. The other prong is when there are governments that are not of our liking, we will use our military, go in, overthrow these governments, and establish democratic regimes, okay? Now and eventually we will have global hegemony. Now, within the heartland theory of Halford Mackinder is the fact that there's the heartland, i.e. Russia, but there's also the periphery, or what Spikeman called the rimland, which is obviously Central Asia and the Middle East. So if the US wants to control the heartland, it has to control the rimland. And so that gives another theoretical or conceptual rationalization for these wars going into Central Asia and the Middle East. Now, if you can't overthrow a government and establish a pro-US or pro-Western NATO regime, well, we'll just destabilize the country, carry out a forever war or permanent war, which will reverberate back into the heartland. And that may destabilize Russia. This may sound Pollyannish, but this is, I believe very strongly, the framework of rationalization and ideas that are brewing in the neoconservatives' minds at this time. Why I can say this is the second point is that this was concretized by the policies of a new policy planning organization and was founded in the early, right around the end of the Cold War, called the Project for a New American Century. And if founded by Wolfowitz and Pearl and all these people. And if you go back and read their documents, they are going to subscribe to the ideas of Mackinder and propose the kind of things that I just laid out. But if one feels what I've said so far is suspect, there's a third level to understand what's going on, is because within the national security state, which goes back to the post-war, immediate post-war era, is that the National Security Council and other agencies within the government, including the Pentagon and also the State Department, they come up with national security strategies, okay? And in 2002, what emerged was National Security Memorandum 2002, which basically said that the United States' policy towards Eurasia was that it could not allow a competitor state to emerge in Eurasia, because that would be a threat to United States interests, okay? And out of that, what we hear is the Wolfowitz doctrine, okay? Or one could even argue the Bush doctrine as well. All of these levels, the Halford Mackinder Heartland Theory, Project for a New American Century, the National Security Memoranda, et cetera, the Defense Department Strategic Memoranda, et cetera, all kind of create a framework to understand events. Now, if you don't want to trust that, in 1997, our boy Zbigniew Brzezinski, the architect of all of this, going back to July of 1979, he publishes a book in 1997 called The Grand Chessboard, which calls the something to the effect, the primacy of U.S. policy in the 21st century, something to that effect, where he codifies this whole thing. And all you have to do is go back and read the Grand Chessboard, and almost everything that's happened since 2001, he laid out, okay? Now, that's what I want to say before we talk about the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan.
Before we get to that, let's also talk about China, because one of the things that Reagan did in order to weaken the Soviet Union is to support this rapprochement with the Chinese government, the Communist Party, and for massive U.S. investment in China. Now, there's a need of U.S. capitalists to have new markets to invest in. China is the largest market in the world, but it's actually the United States and the imperialist Europeans as well who decide that they're going to invest capital in China in a big way to modernize China, to develop it, and to take over what the Russians or the Soviet Union had done, and to basically export capital into China to build up its infrastructure, to build up its resources. So it was in opposition to the Soviet Union that they were doing that, but that effect has been, and this is the period we're in now, where China now is the major growth engine of the world economy, and the United States actually has strengthened China by its intervention around the world.
Exactly. I call it the old boomerang effect, okay? the U.S. normalized, Nixon and Kissinger normalized relations in China so that under the adage is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, so the Chinese could go after the Soviet Union. And then once Mao dies, we see the capitalist restoration in China, aided strongly by the United States, and to the benefit of U.S. corporations dramatically. And then all of a sudden, in the last 15 or 20 years, China is now not only the largest economic force in the world, but from the U.S. vantage point, it is now our strategic competitor, rival, and in many ways, its enemy. Now, to jump ahead of where we're going to kind of end up with this stuff, part of my thinking about this planned withdrawal from Afghanistan is that it possibly could, it is a ruling class decision. It's not Biden's decision per se. He's going to be handle the label of the messy withdrawal. But we see Trump initiating this process as well. I think much of this has to do is to cut their losses in Afghanistan so they can resume the escalation of the military encirclement of China, which is what I think this is all about. But we'll go into that in a little while. Yes, Steve?
And the Democrats, again, the corporate media in the United States is talking about the collapse of its support in Afghanistan, is shocked about it. And it now it's revealed that $2.3 trillion has been invested in this adventure. I mean,
by the way, you want to notice too that the U.S. media keeps saying the word billions. They don't want the American public to realize $2.3 trillion were spent in Afghanistan.
That's $300 million a day.
Yes,
by the Democrats and Republicans in this U.S. imperialist
and most
intervention.
of that money goes to U.S. arms producers. It doesn't go to people on the ground in Afghanistan.
Well, that was interesting because on Fox there was a Republican congressman from Oregon that they had on, and they asked him, why did this war go on so long? Longest war, 20 years. And he said, the military-industrial complex. This is on Fox, and the commentator said, no, well, I beg to differ with you on that issue. You know, why did the war go on? But that to let that come out on Fox is an example. In other words, the military-industrial complex, the capitalists who made money, the contractors and all these people, there was an investment for profit in Afghanistan through the military-industrial complex. The stocks of these companies were going up massively because of it, and now they're lost. But the corporate media is, of course, is complicit because they were in favor of going into Iraq. They were in favor of going into Afghanistan. I remember the corporate media, in fact, Fox, were bringing together generals how we're saying how we could go into Afghanistan. First, they said we should not send a U.S. military intervention in Afghanistan and get dragged in like the Russians. We don't want to repeat the Russian experience. And then the next point, they're saying we need to get the infidels around the world, the fundamentalists around the world to overthrow this government. We shouldn't do it ourselves, but we should get the fundamentalists to do it. They're going to do our work.
Right.
So that was what they were arguing to the American people on the corporate media, that we wouldn't be involved because we'd have the fundamentalists there doing that job of overthrowing the Russians. So this whole machinations of U.S. imperialism and what they tell the American people now is blowing up because of it. And the collapse of the United States and Afghanistan, the relationship to collapse in Vietnam, where the U.S. military intervention into Vietnam led to a catastrophic collapse for U.S. imperialism. And the military, you have to think about what the military, the soldiers who lost their lives, who lost their buddies in Afghanistan for what? And they're asking now, what do we fight for? The U.S. military. What we were fighting for, and it's for imperialism, for investments, for control of this region by the United States. I mean, that's what it's about. I mean, as Smedley Butler said in Central America, we're there for the multinationals. We're there to make money for the multinationals, the billionaires who run the United States.
Yeah. There's a whole bunch of literature talking about this U.S. strategies in the war. And one article I found recently in Asia Times, written by a guy named Wright, was that he laid out very clearly that by 2010, the US military knew that there was no way it could defeat the Taliban resistance. And for a variety of reasons, for example, the Taliban had no infrastructure to bomb, okay, for example. But the point of the article and other pieces of literature I've read is that they knew as early as 2009, 2010, that this was an unwinnable war, but no steps were taken to get out of the war, just the opposite, okay? Because it was a boondoggle for the military industrial complex. And I want to add also, certainly it was a boondocks for many of the collaborators and the governments under Karzai, et cetera. But it was also a boondoggle for the non-governmental organizations, which is an apparatus that has been gelling since the 1980s under the rubric of the neoliberal privatization of services, et cetera, et cetera. And so the lifestyle of these NGOs in Afghanistan were fueled, for example, living in fortified houses in Kabul where rents were $10,000 a month, okay? Those kinds of things were going on with largesse coming from the American taxpayer.
The actual social structure under the United States was that you didn't have a real infrastructure. You had privatization, you had corruption, you had payoffs. The conditions, one figure that people should be aware of is 50% of the people in Afghanistan are dependent on on international aid. So in other words, the survival of 50% of the people in Afghanistan is dependent on US aid, which means that the United States has not built any structure for the people of Afghanistan. They're dependent on the United States for aid and other quote unquote organizations, international organizations support them. So and Afghanistan is a wealthy country.
Right.
Afghanistan has resources. It could survive, but not under the structure and control of the United States, US and
by the way, an interesting development, and there's a really good article written by Chris Harman called Afghanistan, the Good War, published in, I think, 2008, International Socialism website. One might differ with the line of that organization, but he, having been on the ground doing field research in the early 70s there, had a good feel for Afghanistan. And he argues very strongly what was interesting about the US military invasion in 2001 is that nobody fought in Afghanistan against the resistance initially. It took 2 or 3 years before the resistance emerged. He argues that initially the country was so devastated by decades of war, people were exhausted and didn't want to carry out any more fighting for the obvious reason. Secondly, they wanted to carry out a wait and see position related to what the US was going to do. Keep in mind, the US is promising nation building, democratization, and all these kinds of things. What that basically meant was to establish a corrupt client government in Kabul. But by 2004, Harman proposes, and the historical record backs this up, is you begin to see the resistance take off from 2004 all the way to this week. And he argues the reasons for the rise of the resistance is, first of all, the Afghan people had thought that maybe there was going to be an economic reconstruction of the country on the part of the United States. But obviously that didn't take place. At the same time, they see the corruption, not only of the government, but also they see the corruption of the NGOs as well. Now, one also has to realize that as this is unfolding, we have Katrina in New Orleans, and we see that the United States isn't going to reconstruct New Orleans either. So within the neoliberal monopoly financialization stage of capitalism, the US isn't into nation building in real terms. It may argue that it's that, but that's not the case. The second reason why the resistance began was a response to the brutality of the special forces and how they went after individuals and families in the various villages and towns throughout the countries. And when there was resistance, then the US Air Force would come in and bomb these areas as well. And that obviously accelerated the resistance. So there are other factors as well. But it was out of the emergence of that resistance that we see the Taliban more or less. By the way, the Taliban had made a deal with the US when they first went in that they were going to go back to their villages and do nothing. Well, they sat on their hands basically, or at least waited until that moment. And then that's when the Taliban reconstructed or reconstituted itself. And the events of the last week indicate where that was all going to be headed.
Now, the other question is, we're talking about the decline of the American empire, the decline of US imperialism internationally, and the ability of the United States to intervene internationally, because the ramifications of US military defeat in Afghanistan may force it leaving other countries, Syria, Iraq, Japan, Korea. It has 800 bases all over the world. There's massive amounts of money, $850 billion a year going to the US military. At the time that there's internecine warfare in the United States, the infrastructure is falling apart. Imagine that right now, they can't even pass a bill to build up the infrastructure in the United States, and they have bases all over the world to protect US imperial interests. Do you think this is going to escalate?
Yeah. And the rest of the world is seeing that the U.S. doesn't live up to its promises militarily, but more importantly, it can't do the job. Okay, so why rely on the United States? There are a lot of people who are making similar points, but in Harman's article, he has the following sentence, and this is again written around 2008, but it's quite relevant to today. A negotiated settlement and withdrawal, however, on the part of the United States would effectively mean the end of the war on terror, marked by an American defeat. The consequences for American power around the world would be shattering. That would mean the end of American global dominance. We don't have a crystal ball, but we do know we do have history and contours and patterns of history to help us to try to figure out what might be happening. I want to make two points, conceptual points I think are important. One, when we talk about hegemony, what do we mean? Hegemony is kind of a combination of umbrella dominance over an entity, as well as not only coercive or military dominance, but also in ideological influence where people accept the rule of the hegemon because they benefit from the rule of the hegemon, whether it's jobs, monies, subsidies, contracts, security, or whatever, okay? Now, what gives a nation hegemony over the world system? I think simply there's three levels. One is economic, two is military, and three is legitimacy. A country that is the dominant country in the world has the most advanced technology, the most advanced industrial plant in the world. And secondly, it has the viable currency or dominant currency in the world, i.e. the sterling pound in the 19th century and the dollar since 1945 or 44. The second thing that gives it hegemony, again, is military power and military might. And then the third thing is legitimacy. Maybe it's best understood as credibility. It lives up to its promises. It can carry out what it says it wants to do. I think the second major point I want to make is that there is a pattern in the history of the modern world capitalist system where there have been individual countries that have had hegemony: Spain, England, the United States. But there also been, and each time those countries have had a hegemony related to economic dominance, military dominance, and legitimacy, they prevailed. But at the same time, because of the benefits of empire, there is this period of using resources to control the periphery, to control the empire, at the expense of not reinvesting into the economic plant that gave that nation hegemony in the first place, okay? And so we see a relative decline economically. At the same time, you see emerge our competitor states that have new technologies, economic or even military. And then there's a period of competition, rivalry, and war, i.e. regional wars and world war, okay? I think it's safe to say, I think people would understand this, is that from 1945, the US had global hegemony. But I think starting in 68, and certainly by 2001, depending on what date you want to use, the US's hegemony is in relative decline, okay? And that's pretty obvious. The rise of China economically, the gradual shift of some countries no longer using the dollar as a reserve currency, not significant to undermine the United States, but a trend that exists, which in and of itself would cause the collapse of the US global position. And related to military, you have the most powerful military in the world, but it can't win wars, okay? And in fact, it can be defeated by almost a ragamuffin indigenous guerrilla operation. And that's what we've seen in Vietnam, and now we see it in Afghanistan, okay? Now I want to make a comment about a sidebar to what I'm saying, is that one of the interesting lessons of the modern world and modern history is that an imperialist occupier cannot defeat an indigenous guerrilla war or guerrilla movement. It is impossible. But somehow it is a lesson that the United States has refused to learn. It didn't learn it out of Vietnam. And in fact, there were always the questions, what are the lessons of Vietnam? Well, the lessons of Vietnam is you don't start these wars, okay? Now they did temper it a little bit because they use surrogates and drones and all kinds of things. But the bottom line is you still can't beat an indigenous war. Now, the third level of hegemony is credibility or legitimacy. And that's what you just referred to, Steve, is how can under Trump, we saw that legitimacy weaken dramatically among our allies, or the US allies, they're not mine, in Europe, for example. Now with this defeat, you just read the international press. Look at what the British are saying, the military in Britain, or the Europeans, or the Japanese. Biden himself this week talked to South Korea and Japan and said, you can trust us, and you can rely on us, okay? This is just an aberration, etc. So what we're seeing is this speeding up of the decline of the US in world history. And this is a historical process. People ask me, well, how do you feel about what's going on in the world? I said, to me, as an academic, a scholar, a revolutionary, this is the most fascinating time in world history. But at the same time, on a personal level, this is the scariest time that I've ever observed in my life as well.
Well, you have, I mean, in a global level, the climate crisis, and you are suffering part of it with the heat wave. Millions, particularly and around the world, may die. You have then the COVID crisis, where American capitalism, American imperialism is unable to stop the COVID contamination, the pandemic. And they say that on the one hand, you have the Republicans or Trump saying that just ignore it, the herd immunity, that will solve it, and let it rip. And this is in England, the UK, and Bolsonaro in Brazil. So you have that, and then you have the Democrats saying, well, the solution is vaccines. Let's just give vaccines to people. We don't have to shut down. We don't have to have zero COVID tolerance. And in which China is doing, and other countries, Taiwan. So you have a situation in the United States where this pandemic could go on for years. And they pump money into the economy through Keynesian policies. They're buying up, actually, they're spending billions buying up hedge fund money, bonds, to keep hedge funds going. So the financial stability of the whole global financial system, which China is a part of and integrated into the WTO, into the world financial system, is the fragility is growing of this world financial system. And you have a situation in the United States where the Democrats are continuing to support this system, which they are part of, and the union bureaucracy, AFL-CIO, the SEIU, the Teamsters, they all support a capitalist structure, which they think is going to benefit workers, but actually the living conditions of workers are declining. Workers have died in the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands because of a lack of PPE in the United States, since it was outsourced to China. You have a situation in which the healthcare system is virtually breaking down in front of our eyes. Nurses are being burned out, and there's no national emergency, despite the fact that the healthcare system is collapsing, particularly in Florida and Texas and Alabama. And it's pretty clear that capitalism as a world system is entering its conceivable death throes with the financial crisis, the pandemic, and the global climate crisis coming to a head. This is a new world situation which the working class of the world has never faced.
There's no question about that. I'd like to wrap up my part in this, Steve, by just reading 2 paragraphs of a little letter I wrote to some friends the other day about the situation. And it kind of deals with the defeat in Vietnam, Saigon, in April of 1975, and how the U.S. responded to that, and the defeat in Afghanistan, and whether the U.S. can respond to that defeat. This is maybe sketchy, but it does lay out a framework that could be explored and researched in much deeper terms. The question is, can the United States reverse this decline? After the final defeat in Vietnam, the United States was able to reassert its global hegemony. This was accomplished through 1, a monopolization of new telecommunication and high-tech innovations; 2, revive permanent war, i.e. the Reagan doctrine and military Keynesianism; and 3, restructure the post-war automobile industrial complex accumulation model into a neoliberal financialization model. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, that reasserted global hegemon assumed the stance of sole superpower. That hubris gave license to the aforementioned neoconservative project, that is NATO enlargement, military encirclement of Russia and China, the war on terror, et cetera, et cetera. Today, the United States does not have any realistic and viable options within the framework of capitalism to reassert its absolute global hegemony. The reasons for that include: 1, the domestic economy is in shambles, amplified by COVID. 2, the dominant class is not willing to give up any of its wealth to invest in a new green, sustainable economy. 3, its military has been completely discredited in Afghanistan, with the prospects of forced withdrawals in Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere, as well as the possibility of a collapse of morale within the military ranks. 3, there is no coherent and organized ruling class in the United States committed to managing the crisis as a national project. And 4, domestic Democratic Republican politics are polarized, corrupted, and gridlocked, with the specter of fascists embedded in the Republican Party. Finally, the problem I see is that the United States is so embedded in the militarized pursuit of absolute global hegemony that rather than reassess its post-war imperialist project and accept its decline cooperatively with the nations of the world, it may strike out with an uncontrollable vengeance.
So that is the danger. The danger is another adventure. And historically, declining imperialist empires do become more and more adventurous.
Yeah.
So
it's like a wounded animal in a glass shop. They get more violent.
So I think that we've gone over a lot of territory, and I think we have resurrected really the real history, the real background of how the United States was responsible actually for the jihadist fundamentals coming to power in Afghanistan, and how the failure of US imperialism in Afghanistan is not an accident, not a mistake, not a mystery, but is the nature of imperialism and the decline of an imperialist power and the result of that. And that is what we face today on the anniversary of 9/11 and the rapid withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan and likely many more countries in the Middle East. So thanks for joining us on Work Week.
Thank you, Steve.